I'm producing a video book a reading of François Laruelle's A Biography of Ordinary Man. And I'm doing that, in fact, because of my reading of Zizek, in particular, Sex and the Failed Absolute, and because of my prior reading of a book by Badiou, his third big volume in the Being an Event series or trilogy, because it's finished now, I suppose. The translation will be coming out in February next year. It was published in 2018, and in both books there's an emphasis not just on a new positive apprehension of the subject, but on what was thought to be another discarded concept, the absolute. And these two concepts are being deployed as an important part of a dispositif that can be strong enough to answer the current, although it's been going for a while now, a dominant ideology, which is an uneasy, incoherent mixture of bio-materialism and what I call democratic relativism. So the democratic relativism part is the tendency to regard anything except my own ideas and my own experience as a social construct. The biomaterialism is an attempt to stick within the bounds of my experience that I take as real and material and not constructed. So you get that coming up with even greater force and visibility within the current COVID crisis, whether on the right with people who consider that the whole virus is a social construction and that their own bodily freedom is the most important value to maintain, or on the left with people who seem to think if only we believe in science and we get away from the social constructions that are the conspiracy theories, we'll be able to come to an end to the current crisis. So we have this mixture of, in different dosages or different proportions and directed in different ways, of biomaterialism as an empiricist realist base and social constructionism as an explanation of what's wrong with society. In order to fight that mixture and to not give in to either one or other pole, both Badiou and Zizek have felt the necessity to revive the notion of the absolute and to bring it into new knottings or combinations with what was once thought to be a discarded concept within the postmodern relativist variations, and to see what can be done if you deploy both of these concepts together. I was thinking about this and trying to understand it and push it further, and I came to the conclusion that there's something about the current debates and the current problematics that are reminiscent of what was happening in France in the 1980s. So there was a similar combination of biomaterialism and democratic relativism that had come out of the end of the 60s and all through the 70s. And there was a similar turn to accepting the ideological critiques that had been put forward in the 70s, but undoing this total depersonalization and dissolution within the multiplicities in flux that had come out of the 70s. So many thinkers started in 1981, started to change their orientation in thought. So our first change can be seen with Laruelle's The Principle of Minority. In The Principle of Minority, which he published in 1981, Laruelle saw the necessity of starting out, well, not exactly starting out because he has a whole process coming up to it, of putting in first position, if you will, the idea of the absolute. At that stage, he was still trying to work his way out of a sort of Derridean, Lyotardian, Deleuzian, Foucauldian synthesis that he produced in the 70s, and he saw the danger of relativism and of dissolution, and on the other side of bio-materialistic dogmatism, and he basically went back to what he thought of as first principles and the need for an absolute. Straight after, in 1982, Badiou initiated his turn towards the subject, in theory of the subject. That two sets of research programs, one privileging the absolute and the other privileging the subject in a new idea of the subject, can be seen to converge in Laruelle's book, Biography of Ordinary Man, which he published in 1985. There he says that there's no point trying to sort of laboriously get to the absolute. You have to begin with the absolute. And he says quite explicitly, I don't think he's particularly alluding to Badiou or claiming an influence, but these ideas were already being imposed by the logic, the internal logic of the prior research programs, which were coming to a limit and needed a big transformation in order to solve the current intellectual and practical problems. So Laruelle says that we need the absolute as subject, which is something that you can find in Zizek later. Laruelle develops it in a Biography of Ordinary Man in a sort of totally pure form. He eschews any quotations. He doesn't refer to, except by means of allusions, to any of his contemporary rivals, if you want, and he certainly doesn't refer to Lacan or to Hegel, but that was his position in 1985. The absolute is starting point, the subject as absolute. 3 years later, Zizek's book, the first, I suppose, in that sort of revisioning and transformation of the meta research program that many of these thinkers had in common in terms of the theoretical network that was the context for their ideas and problematics. In 1988, Zizek published the most sublime of hysterics, Lacan with Hegel, and it was a revisioning of Hegel as propounding an absolute outside of totalizations, and in identification is maybe the wrong word, but inherently subject. So this idea of refusing totalities and totalization is present within Laruelle's A Biography of Ordinary Man, but he doesn't even think of revisioning Hegel within those terms. He just introduces the notion of absolute and goes on from there. So Zizek, as well as seeing these ideas as crucial, non-totalization and an absolute as a non-totality and the absolute as subject, Zizek finds a way of getting useful weapons or tools or advice from Hegel. In the same year, in 1988, of course, Laruelle didn't do anything in that year. Badiou published Being an Event, which was the first book in this ultimate paradigm in Badiou's work, which would lead to the immanence of truths. A couple of years, 3 years later, once again 3, the magic number, Deleuze and Guattari published What is Philosophy? And it's not usually remarked on, but in this book, the word absolute is quite frequently employed, mainly as an adjective, a few times as a noun, and it's employed when we talk about absolute outside, absolute overview, and so on, absolute speed. It's employed in a very positive way, in a favorable way, whereas before the word absolute was a no-no in French philosophy. Along with this use of the word absolute as an adjective, you have quite a huge number of mentions and uses of the word infinite and a lot of other synonyms, expressions or single words for this notion of the infinite, which is identified implicitly with the absolute. But Deleuze and Guattari don't have the technical mathematical material to give formalized and rigorous substance to these conjectures. They develop it more in an intuitive way, and I would say that their project is incomplete. Both died too young, and we're faced with the problem that the last work that Deleuze wrote is unpublished, and by that I'm not referring to his unpublished manuscript on Marx. that I don't think was even finished. I'm referring to Deleuze's correspondence with Badiou. Badiou recounts in his book on Deleuze that they began a correspondence after What is Philosophy, and seems to have lasted about 2 or 3 years, from 1992 to 1994. At the end of that time, they concluded that they had gone as far as possible in expounding their own ideas, exploring them, and exploring the differences between their two different perspectives. So, in a certain sense, we can consider that this work of correspondence was complete. The problem is that Deleuze had an about face and decided to forbid any publication of his letters. So I think that's a very big gap and a very big shame in terms of the evolution of these ideas. So after that we have various things happening, but on this central axis of the subject and the absolute, we had to wait till 2018 when Badiou published The Immanence of Truths in French, and it's coming out in February, maybe February. It's coming out next year in 2022. And a related evolution led to Zizek's book Sex and the Failed Absolute. So there's quite a constellation of evolutions and problematics and knots and linkages around a revised, revisioned, reformatted idea of the subject, and a revised, revisioned, reformatted idea of the absolute. So the ancestor, the vanishing mediator, maybe, if you will, is Laruelle's book, published in English in 2018. And I think because of this new conceptual context furnished by Zizek and Badiou, Laruelle's book has a new timeliness. It's an untimely book because in some ways it was sort of out of date when it was published. In a certain way, it came too late. And at the same time, a precursor or a forerunner for evolutions that would come later, that is to say, in the last few years. So I'm reading the book and publishing my reading in video form, trying to rethink the book. But I'm not a Laruellian, so I'm not trying to say Laruelle was right or stick strictly within the stakes as Laruelle saw them. I'm trying to give an immanent reading that's very faithful to the linear order of the text, and at the same time I'm reading Laruelle with these ideas of Deleuze and Badiou and Zizek in mind, so as to hope that all of them mutually illuminate each other.